Hey everyone, tonight we begin with the devastating betrayal and burning vengeance of Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni, whose motherly fury and iron will brought the mighty Roman Empire to its knees. Her rebellion was swift, merciless, and unforgettable, a defining moment when a broken woman chose to break an empire rather than bow to it. From peaceful client queen to the terror of Roman Britain, Boudica's life was a wildfire wrapped in royal bronze and righteous rage. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these gentle journeys into history's darkest moments. Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift together into tonight's tale of justice and vengeance. You are not waking up in a palace. There are no marble columns or golden fixtures. You are opening your eyes in a circular house of wood and clay, with a thatched roof that leaks smoke like an old chimney having a conversation with the sky. Outside, the British wind whispers across endless moors. Inside, your mother hums something older than Rome, older than conquest, older than the pain that's coming. Take a moment now to settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of today's worries lift from your chest, because tonight, we're traveling to a time when a single candle could light an entire evening, when the sound of rain on a thatched roof was better than any symphony, and when falling asleep meant trusting in tomorrow's sunrise. Close your eyes if you'd like, or let them rest softly on something peaceful nearby. Because our story begins not in a palace or a battlefield, but in a small village where smoke curls lazily from chimneys, where the evening air carries the scent of bread and wood smoke, and where a young woman named Boudica is about to discover that sometimes the quietest lives can echo through eternity. Imagine, if you will, waking up in ancient Britain. Not the Britain of castles and knights that fills our movies, but the real Britain of the 1st century CE. The year is around 30 AD, and you are opening your eyes in a roundhouse, a circular home with walls of woven wood and clay, topped with a thick thatched roof that keeps out the rain but lets in the smoke from your central fire. The floor beneath you isn't polished wood or carpet. It's packed earth, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Your bed isn't a mattress, but furs and woven blankets laid over dried heather. And the sound that wakes you isn't an alarm clock, but the gentle lowing of cattle and the soft voices of your family already beginning their day. This is the world Boudica knew as a child, not the warrior queen of legend, not yet the woman who would shake the Roman Empire to its foundations, but simply a girl learning to navigate a world where survival was never guaranteed, and comfort was earned through patience and skill. In this ancient world, your morning routine would be vastly different from ours. There's no running water, so you wash your face and hands in a wooden bowl filled with water carried from the nearest stream. The water is cold, always cold, because heating water means starting a fire, and fires require precious fuel that must be gathered stick by stick, branch by branch. Picture young Boudica, perhaps 8 years old, carrying bundles of dry wood back to her family's roundhouse. Her arms ache from the weight, but she doesn't complain. In her world, everyone contributes from the moment they can walk steadily. The wood she gathers will cook tonight's meal, warm the house through the cold evening, and provide light for her grandmother's stories. Her small hands learn early the difference between wood that burns clean and wood that smolders with bitter smoke. She discovers that birch bark makes excellent kindling, that oak burns long and hot, that pine fills the house with resin-scented warmth, but also with sparks that can ignite the thatch overhead. These aren't academic lessons, but survival skills that might one day mean the difference between warmth and cold, light and darkness, life and death. Her breakfast isn't grabbed from a refrigerator. If she's lucky, it's porridge made from oats or barley, perhaps sweetened with honey if the bees have been generous, and if her family can afford such luxury. More often, it's yesterday's bread, now hard and requiring careful chewing, washed down with water or, if she's fortunate, milk from her family's cows. But here's what might surprise you about this ancient morning. Despite the lack of modern conveniences, there's a rhythm to it that our rushing modern lives have lost. Each task flows into the next. There's no hurry because there's nowhere to rush to. The sun sets the schedule, the seasons dictate the work, and time moves like honey, thick, golden, and impossible to speed up. Young Boudica learns this rhythm in her bones. She understands that morning means checking on the animals, feeling for warm eggs in the chicken roosts, making sure the cattle haven't wandered in the night, counting the sheep to ensure none have fallen prey to wolves. She learns that midday means work in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, or indoor tasks like spinning wool and mending clothes during the darker months. The spinning wheel becomes her companion during long winter evenings. Her fingers learn to draw out the wool into long, even threads, to feel when the tension is right, to sense when the thread might break. It's meditative work that allows the mind to wander while the hands stay busy. She listens to adult conversations, absorbing news from other villages, learning about tribal politics and trade relationships, understanding the complex web of obligations and alliances that hold their world together. The Iceni village where she grows up is small by modern standards, perhaps 50 roundhouses clustered together for protection and community. But to a child, it feels vast and full of wonders. There's the smithy where iron tools are forged, the sound of hammer on anvil ringing across the settlement like a metallic heartbeat. The smith, a man named Kalgakis, whose arms are permanently stained with soot and whose reputation extends to neighboring tribes, becomes one of young Boudica's heroes. She watches in fascination as he transforms raw iron into plowshares, sword blades, horse bits, and the intricate bronze ornaments that mark social status. There's the weaving house where the women gather to work on large projects, their voices rising and falling in conversation as their hands work the threads. Here Boudica learns not just the technical skills of textile production, but the social arts of negotiation, consensus building, and conflict resolution. Women's work in her society is never separate from political work. The decisions made in the weaving house about resource allocation, marriage alliances, and tribal priorities often prove as important as those made in formal councils. The dye vats behind the weaving house hold their own mysteries. Boudica learns to identify the plants that yield different colors. Madder root for deep reds, woad for the sacred blue that warriors paint on their faces, walnut hulls for rich browns, and the precious purple that comes from imported shellfish, affordable only for the most important ceremonial garments. Each color carries meaning, and learning to read those meanings is part of understanding how her society communicates status, identity, and intention without words. The market days are especially magical. Traders arrive from distant tribes, their pack animals loaded with goods that seem to come from another world entirely. Baltic amber, the color of trapped sunlight, harvested from shores so far north that they exist only in legend. Salt from the western shores, white as snow and precious as silver, necessary for preserving meat through the long winters. Bronze ornaments crafted by artisans whose skills have been passed down through generations. Their techniques so closely guarded that even examining the finished pieces reveals few secrets. Young Boudica watches wide-eyed as these treasures are displayed, bargained over, and sometimes purchased by her father for special occasions. She learns that trade is more than simple exchange of goods. It's a complex dance of relationships, reputation, and reciprocal obligation. The trader who offers fair deals and honest goods earns the right to return next season. The one who cheats or misrepresents his wares finds himself unwelcome in future markets. But perhaps the most important part of her education happens in the evenings, when the work is done and the family gathers around their central fire. This is when the stories come alive. Her grandmother, a woman whose face is mapped with wrinkles, but whose memory is sharp as flint, tells tales that stretch back through time like roots reaching deep into the earth. These aren't just entertainment, though they certainly entertain. These stories carry the weight of law, history, and wisdom all braided together. Young Boudica learns about the gods who live in the oak groves and the sacred springs. She hears about heroes who faced impossible odds and found ways to triumph through cleverness rather than strength. She absorbs lessons about honor, loyalty, and the intricate web of obligations that hold their society together. One story that particularly captures her imagination is about Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes, a woman who rules a tribe even larger than the Iceni. In Boudica's world, female leadership isn't unusual or shocking. It's simply another way the gods distribute their gifts. Some people are born with strong backs for farming, others with clever fingers for metalwork, and still others with the wisdom and presence needed to guide communities through difficult decisions. Her grandmother tells her about the ancient queens who led their people in times of crisis, women whose names have been preserved in song and story for generations. There was Medibi of Connaught, who commanded armies and negotiated treaties with kings. There was Scathach, the warrior teacher, who trained heroes in the arts of combat and strategy. These women weren't exceptions to the natural order, but examples of it. Proof that leadership ability flows through both male and female lines according to the gods' inscrutable will. But even in this peaceful rhythm of daily life, there are whispers of change coming. Boudica is perhaps 12 when the first Roman merchants begin appearing in their markets. They're easily recognizable. Their clothes are different, made from fabrics woven in patterns no British loom could create. Their skin has the pale softness of people who spend their days indoors, rather than working under the sky, and they speak Latin, a language that sounds harsh and clipped compared to the flowing Celtic tongues of the British tribes. At first, these merchants seem harmless enough. They bring wonderful goods, pottery so fine it's almost translucent, wine that tastes like liquid sunshine, jewelry crafted with techniques no British smith has mastered. They pay well for British goods too, especially the high-quality iron and the beautiful enameled metalwork that British craftsmen produce. The bronze mirrors and decorated shields that leave British workshops return months later as luxury items in Roman markets, their prices inflated far beyond what their original creators ever imagined. But the adults whisper about them when they think the children aren't listening. Why are these Romans so interested in British roads and harbors? Why do they ask so many questions about tribal alliances and military strengths? And why do they always seem to be counting things? Counting houses? Counting cattle? Counting people? Boudica's father, a man named Esicos, who serves as one of her uncle's war chiefs, explains it to her one evening as they sit by the fire. Romans don't just trade, he says, his voice low and thoughtful. They prepare. Every merchant is also a spy. Every trade mission is also reconnaissance. They're learning about us, little one. The question is why? The answer comes when Boudica is 13, old enough to understand the gravity of what she's witnessing, but still young enough to believe that adults can solve any problem given enough time and thought. Ships appear on the horizon, not the small trading vessels they've grown accustomed to, but enormous warships carrying thousands of soldiers. The Roman invasion of Britain has begun, and nothing will ever be the same. The invasion itself is both slower and faster than anyone expects. Slower because the Romans don't simply charge across the countryside, conquering everything in their path. Instead, they establish beachheads, build fortified camps, and advance methodically like craftsmen working on a project that will take years to complete. They move with the patience of people who know that time is on their side, that their resources are virtually unlimited, that they can afford to proceed carefully rather than risk costly mistakes. But faster, because the psychological impact is immediate and devastating. For generations, the British tribes have fought among themselves with a kind of ritual quality to their conflicts. Battles are important, but they're also limited. Warriors face each other in single combat. Cattle raids are common, but rarely deadly, and even larger conflicts tend to end with negotiated settlements rather than total destruction. War, in the British tradition, is a way of settling disputes and establishing dominance, not a method of completely destroying your enemies. The Romans fight differently. They fight to win permanently. When they defeat a British force, they don't just take cattle or tribute. They take the land itself, build roads across it, and settle their own people there. They don't negotiate with defeated chiefs. They replace them with Roman administrators. They don't honor British gods. They tear down sacred groves and build temples to their own deities. Boudica watches her world change day by day. The great hill fort that has protected her people for centuries is abandoned as militarily obsolete. Roman siege engines can reduce such defenses to rubble in a matter of days. The tribal councils that once made decisions about war and peace find themselves reduced to debating how best to accommodate Roman demands. Young men, who once expected to prove themselves as warriors, are instead recruited to build Roman roads and buildings. The psychological impact on someone like Boudica, raised to expect eventual leadership of her people, must have been profound. Imagine being trained from childhood to inherit a kingdom, only to watch that kingdom systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to foreign specifications. Every skill you've learned, every relationship you've cultivated, every assumption about how the world works, all of it becomes outdated almost overnight. Yet, this is also when she first demonstrates the adaptability and intelligence that will later make her such a formidable leader. Instead of simply mourning the loss of the old ways, she begins learning about the new reality. She studies Latin, not because she loves the language, but because understanding your conqueror's words is essential for survival. She observes Roman customs and legal procedures, looking for weaknesses and contradictions that might be exploited later. It's during this period of upheaval that Boudica meets Prasutagus, the man who will become both her husband and her partner in the impossible task of preserving Iceni independence in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Prasutagus is perhaps 10 years older than Boudica, already established as a warrior and political leader among the Iceni, when they first meet at a tribal gathering called to discuss the Roman situation. Their courtship, if it can be called that, takes place against the backdrop of the Roman invasion. This isn't a romantic fairy tale, but a political alliance between two people who recognize in each other the intelligence and determination needed to navigate their changing world. Prasutagus has already fought against the Romans and lost. Boudica has watched her childhood world disappear. Together, they represent both the old ways and the new realities. Their wedding, when it takes place, is a blend of defiance and adaptation. The ceremony follows ancient Celtic traditions, hand fasting before the tribe, oaths sworn over iron and salt, blessings from the Druids who somehow continue to practice their religion despite increasing Roman restrictions. But the gifts they receive include Roman pottery alongside traditional bronze torques, wine from Gaul next to mead brewed from local honey. Even their marriage feast reflects the strange new world they're creating together. Prasutagus has already begun the delicate process of negotiating with Roman administrators. He understands, perhaps better than most British leaders, that complete resistance means complete destruction. The Romans have advantages that British warriors simply cannot match: professional armies, sophisticated siege equipment, seemingly unlimited resources, and most importantly, the ability to replace losses from across their vast empire. A British tribe that loses half its warriors in battle may never recover. A Roman legion that suffers similar casualties can be reinforced within months. So Prasutagus chooses a different path: accommodation without assimilation. He agrees to become a client king, technically subordinate to Rome, but retaining practical authority over his own people. He pays tribute to Roman governors, but insists on collecting it according to traditional methods. He allows Roman merchants to trade in Iceni territory, but ensures that the profits flow primarily to his own people. Boudica proves to be an ideal partner for this complex political balancing act. She has the diplomatic skills needed to negotiate with Roman officials who often underestimate her because of her gender. She also has the tribal authority needed to convince her own people that cooperation with Rome doesn't mean surrender to it. Most importantly, she has the strategic vision to see that their current arrangement, however distasteful, gives them time to adapt and prepare for whatever comes next. Together, they transform the Iceni kingdom into something unprecedented, a British tribe that prospers under Roman rule without losing its essential identity. They adopt Roman agricultural techniques that increase crop yields, use Roman legal concepts to resolve disputes more efficiently, and even employ Roman architects to improve their capital settlement. But they also maintain their traditional festivals, continue to honor their ancestral gods, and ensure that children learn Celtic languages alongside Latin. This cultural synthesis is perhaps most visible in their own household. Their two daughters grow up bilingual, equally comfortable with Roman tutors and Celtic bards. They learn to appreciate Roman poetry while memorizing the genealogies of their own ancestors. They study Roman history while practicing traditional crafts like metalworking and textile production. In many ways, they represent the future Boudica and Prasutagus are trying to build: a British society that can engage with the wider Roman world without losing its soul. The girls, whose names history hasn't preserved, become symbols of this delicate balance. They're princesses in both traditions, wearing Roman-style stolas for formal occasions, but also bearing traditional Celtic torques that mark their royal lineage. They speak Latin with Roman visitors, but switch seamlessly to Celtic when addressing their own people. They understand Roman law, but also learn the complex web of kinship obligations and tribal customs that govern Iceni society. For nearly 2 decades, this hybrid arrangement works surprisingly well. The Iceni maintain their independence while avoiding the crushing military defeats that destroy other British tribes. Their territory remains prosperous, their people relatively free, their culture intact though evolving. Boudica and Prasutagus become models for other British leaders trying to navigate the new reality of Roman rule. But the arrangement depends entirely on mutual respect and good faith, qualities that become increasingly rare as the Roman administration in Britain grows more confident and more demanding. The early Roman governors, men like Aulus Plautius and Ostorius Scapula, understood that they were ruling a recently conquered territory where rebellion was always possible. They treated client kings like Prasutagus as valuable allies whose cooperation was essential for maintaining peace. Their successors, however, begin to see client kingdoms not as partners, but as anachronisms, temporary arrangements that should be phased out as quickly as possible. They want direct Roman rule over all of Britain, uniform taxation, Roman law applied universally, and Roman culture replacing British traditions entirely. From their perspective, kings like Prasutagus are obstacles to efficient government rather than pillars supporting it. The pressure begins subtly. Tribute demands increase. Roman officials begin questioning traditional Iceni legal decisions. There are suggestions that the Iceni might benefit from more direct Roman administration. Military patrols through Iceni territory become more frequent and more intrusive. Roman merchants receive preferential treatment in disputes with British traders. Prasutagus and Boudica respond to each pressure point carefully, yielding where they must and resisting where they can. They increase tribute payments, but insist on collecting the money themselves, rather than allowing Roman tax farmers into their territory. They accept Roman observers in their courts, but maintain the right to judge cases according to traditional law. They welcome Roman patrols, but insist that they respect sacred sites and tribal customs. This diplomatic dance continues for years, but both Boudica and Prasutagus can see where it's leading. Each compromise makes the next one easier for Rome to demand. Each precedent they set reduces their room to maneuver in future negotiations. They're being eaten alive slowly, like a deer being consumed by ants. Each individual bite is tiny, but eventually the cumulative effect is fatal. The crisis comes, as crises often do, when they're least prepared for it. Prasutagus falls ill during the winter of 59, 60 CE. At first it seems like nothing serious, a cough that lingers longer than usual, fatigue that doesn't improve with rest. But gradually it becomes clear that this is something more severe, probably lung disease exacerbated by years of stress and the damp British climate. Ancient medicine has few remedies for such ailments. The Druids try their traditional healing herbs and rituals. Roman physicians are consulted and apply their own methods: bloodletting, purges, complex mixtures of imported drugs. Nothing helps. Prasutagus grows steadily weaker, and by early spring it's obvious that he's dying. This puts Boudica in an impossible position. Under traditional Iceni law, she would inherit leadership of the tribe automatically. The Iceni, like many Celtic peoples, practice inheritance through both male and female lines, and female rulers are not uncommon. But Roman law doesn't recognize female inheritance of political authority. From the Roman perspective, Prasutagus's death means the end of the client kingdom arrangement and the beginning of direct Roman rule. Prasutagus, even on his deathbed, tries to find a solution that will protect his family and preserve some measure of Iceni independence. He dictates a will in Latin, properly witnessed according to Roman legal standards, leaving half his kingdom to Emperor Nero and half to his wife and daughters. The logic is impeccable. Since Rome is going to claim authority over Iceni territory anyway, why not make it a legal inheritance rather than a conquest? And since Roman law does recognize inheritance by women in private matters, perhaps Boudica can maintain authority over her half of the kingdom. It's a clever compromise, the kind of legal creativity that has allowed Prasutagus and Boudica to maintain their independence for 20 years. But it's also a desperate gamble that depends entirely on Roman good faith and respect for their own legal system. These are qualities that have been in increasingly short supply, as the Roman administration in Britain has grown more arrogant and more impatient with British sensibilities. The news of Prasutagus's death travels quickly through Roman administrative circles. For bureaucrats who have long seen the client kingdom system as an inefficient anachronism, his death represents an opportunity to clean up what they consider a messy arrangement. They don't wait for the funeral rites to be completed before beginning their takeover. Within days of Prasutagus' burial, Roman officials arrive at the Iceni capital. They come not as mourners or diplomatic representatives, but as inheritors come to claim their due. Their leader is a procurator named Catus Decianus, a man whose primary qualification for governing Britons seems to be his complete lack of sympathy for British customs or sensibilities. Catus Decianus brings with him a small army of clerks, accountants, and soldiers. Their first act is to demand a complete inventory of Iceni wealth, not just the royal treasury, but private property belonging to individual Iceni families. They claim that all loans made by Romans to Britons over the past 20 years are now due immediately, with interest. They announce that all weapons must be surrendered, all fortifications dismantled, all tribal military units disbanded. What follows is bureaucratic conquest, slow and methodical and devastating in its thoroughness. Roman clerks go house by house through Iceni settlements, cataloging possessions and assigning monetary values. Families who have lived on the same land for generations are told they must now pay rent to Roman landlords. Craftsmen who have practiced their trades for decades are informed that they need Roman licenses to continue working. The psychological impact is overwhelming. Imagine watching strangers walk through your home, making lists of your possessions, deciding what you can keep and what must be surrendered as payment for debts you never agreed to incur. The Iceni have maintained their dignity and independence for 20 years under Roman rule. Now they're being treated like conquered barbarians rather than allied partners. Every aspect of daily life becomes subject to Roman oversight and regulation. The smith who has forged tools and weapons for the community for 30 years is told his workshop must be licensed and inspected. The weaver whose family has supplied cloth to neighboring tribes for generations discovers that her dyes are now considered contraband because they might be used to color military standards. Even the children's education becomes controversial, as Roman administrators question why Iceni youth are still learning their ancestral language and customs. Boudica tries every diplomatic avenue available to her. She requests audiences with higher Roman officials, citing the terms of her husband's will and the agreements that have governed Roman-Iceni relations for 2 decades. She offers alternative payment schedules for the demanded tribute. She proposes compromises that would satisfy Roman legal requirements while preserving Iceni self-governance. Her efforts are not just ignored, they're treated as presumptuous. Roman officials make it clear that they consider her a widow whose authority died with her husband. They inform her that under Roman law, women cannot inherit political power, regardless of what British customs might allow. They suggest that she should be grateful they're allowing her to retain any property at all, rather than demanding additional concessions. The final insult comes when Catus Decianus announces that Boudica herself must surrender her royal torques and other symbols of authority. These aren't just jewelry. They're sacred objects that connect her to generations of Iceni rulers, physical embodiments of her right to lead her people. Demanding their surrender is like demanding that she publicly renounce her identity, her heritage, and her people's independence. When Boudica refuses to comply with this demand, the Romans decide to make an example of her. What happens next is carefully planned humiliation, designed to break not just Boudica, but the spirit of Iceni resistance itself. She is seized by Roman soldiers, stripped of her royal robes, and publicly flogged in the center of her own capital. This is more than physical punishment. It's a deliberate violation of every custom that governs relationships between rulers and subjects, men and women, conquerors and conquered. Celtic law recognizes the physical inviolability of rulers, especially female rulers. Roman law itself supposedly protects women from public corporal punishment, but these niceties are ignored in favor of a brutal demonstration of Roman power. The flogging is not the end of the humiliation. Boudica's daughters, girls who have grown up expecting to inherit leadership roles in their tribe, are subjected to sexual violence by Roman soldiers. This isn't random brutality. It's systematic degradation designed to break the line of succession and demonstrate that no British woman, regardless of rank or age, is safe from Roman authority. The message is clear. Submit completely or watch your family destroyed. The Romans want not just political compliance, but psychological surrender. They want the Iceni to understand that their traditional concepts of honor, dignity, and royal authority are meaningless in the face of Roman power. The immediate aftermath is silence. Boudica lies in the dirt where the Romans left her, her back torn by the whip, her daughters traumatized beyond words. The Iceni people who witness this degradation are too shocked and terrified to move. For 20 years, they've lived under Roman rule while maintaining their sense of dignity and independence. Now they understand that this was an illusion, that Rome has simply been waiting for the right moment to strip away even the pretense of respect. But sometimes the greatest mistakes produce the most powerful responses. The Romans think they've broken Boudica, but they've actually created something far more dangerous. A symbol of injustice so stark and powerful that it burns away every compromise, every accommodation, every reason to cooperate with their rule. As Boudica struggles to her feet and gathers her daughters into her arms, something fundamental changes in the political landscape of Roman Britain. The careful balance that she and Prasutagus maintained for 2 decades collapses instantly. The policy of accommodation that kept the peace dies with the last shred of Roman credibility. The loyal client queen becomes something the Romans have never faced before, a British leader with absolutely nothing left to lose. What follows is not immediate explosion, but careful, methodical preparation. Boudica understands that emotional response without strategic planning is simply suicide. If she wants revenge, and she does, she needs to be smart about it. She needs allies, weapons, organization, and most importantly, she needs to strike at targets where Roman weakness will be exposed rather than Roman strength. The first step is medical recovery. The whip wounds on her back heal slowly, and the psychological trauma to her daughters requires even more careful attention. But even during this period of physical healing, Boudica is working. She sends messages to other British tribes, not dramatic declarations of war, but quiet inquiries about their experiences with Roman administration. What she discovers confirms her worst fears. What happened to her is part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. The Trinovantes, who have lived under direct Roman rule for nearly 20 years, tell stories of systematic exploitation and cultural destruction. The Roman colony at Camulodunum was built on their land, their sacred sites destroyed to make room for a temple honoring the deified Emperor Claudius. They've been forced to contribute labor and materials for construction projects that serve only Roman interests. Their young men are conscripted into Roman auxiliary units and sent to fight wars in distant parts of the empire. Other tribes report similar experiences. Traditional leaders are replaced by Roman appointees. Ancient legal customs are overridden by Roman law. Sacred groves are cut down and replaced by Roman temples. Children are taught Latin and Roman history while their own languages and traditions are marginalized. The systematic destruction of British culture is not a side effect of Roman rule, it's the deliberate policy. Armed with this information, Boudica begins building something unprecedented in British history, a coalition that crosses traditional tribal boundaries. The Iceni have ancient feuds with the Trinovantes, old disputes over territory and tribute that go back generations. But both tribes now face a common threat that makes their traditional conflicts seem petty and irrelevant. The process is slow and delicate. Tribal ambassadors meet in sacred groves under cover of religious festivals. Messages are passed through networks of traders and craftsmen. Even the Druids, normally focused on spiritual rather than political matters, begin coordinating their activities across tribal lines. The rebellion that's taking shape isn't just military, it's cultural, spiritual, and psychological. Boudica herself becomes the symbol that unites these disparate groups. Her story spreads from tribe to tribe. Not the story of a failed queen or a broken woman, but the story of someone who has seen through Roman lies and survived to tell the truth. She becomes proof that resistance is possible, that Roman power has limits, that the humiliation they've all endured doesn't have to be permanent. The weapons begin gathering quietly. Old swords are sharpened, hunting spears are refitted for war, shields are repaired and reinforced. But more importantly, the psychological weapons are being forged. Songs that celebrate British heroes and mock Roman pretensions. Stories that remind people what life was like before the conquest. Rituals that connect participants to their ancestors and their land in ways that make Roman authority seem foreign and temporary. The Druids play a crucial role in this preparation, though their involvement is carefully hidden from Roman observers. Officially, Druidism has been banned in Britain. The Romans recognize it as a potential source of resistance and have made practicing druidical religion punishable by death. But driving a religion underground doesn't destroy it, and the Druids continue to function as a network connecting British tribes across the province. They provide the rebellion with something it desperately needs: a sense of cosmic justification. This isn't just political resistance or military strategy. It's a sacred war to restore the proper relationship between the British people and their land. The Romans haven't just conquered territory. They've violated sacred sites, disrupted natural cycles, and broken the spiritual bonds that connect the tribes to their ancestors and their gods. The Druids conduct ceremonies that are part religious ritual and part military planning. They read omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of clouds, but they also coordinate logistics and communication between rebel groups. They offer spiritual preparation for battle, but they also provide practical intelligence about Roman troop movements and supply lines. Most importantly, they give the rebellion a mythological framework that transforms it from a desperate revolt into a sacred obligation. The land itself is calling for liberation. The ancestors are demanding action. The gods are offering their support to those brave enough to answer the call. This spiritual dimension makes the coming conflict about more than political independence. It makes it about the survival of the British soul. While the spiritual and political foundations of the rebellion are being laid, the practical military preparations proceed with equal care. Boudica and her war chiefs understand that they're facing the most professional military machine in the world. Roman legions don't lose battles because their enemies are brave or determined. They lose battles when their enemies are smart enough to exploit Roman weaknesses and patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike. The British advantage lies in numbers, local knowledge, and mobility. They can field forces far larger than any Roman army in Britain. They know every road and river and forest in their territory, and they can move much faster than Roman legions weighed down by baggage trains and siege equipment. But these advantages are only useful if employed correctly, and that requires careful planning and coordination. Scouts begin mapping Roman positions throughout eastern Britain. Supply dumps are established in hidden locations. Routes are planned that avoid Roman forts and stick to terrain where British warriors can fight effectively. Most importantly, targets are selected based on strategic value rather than emotional satisfaction, though in some cases, fortunately, the two coincide. The first target is obvious: Camulodunum, the Roman colony built on stolen Trinovantian land. This settlement has everything the rebels hate about Roman rule: retired legionaries living on confiscated British property, a temple to a Roman emperor built with forced British labor, and a population of Roman citizens who have grown fat and comfortable exploiting British resources. But Camulodunum also has strategic value as a target. It's lightly defended, since the Romans never expected serious British resistance this far from the frontier. It's symbolically important as the first Roman colony in Britain and the seat of the imperial cult, and it's vulnerable to the kind of rapid assault that plays to British strengths, while avoiding prolonged siege warfare that would favor Roman military engineering. As spring turns to summer in 60 CE, the rebellion network expands beyond anything the Romans imagined possible. What began as Iceni resistance to administrative abuse has become a province-wide movement that includes dozens of tribes and hundreds of thousands of people. The Romans have spent 20 years teaching the Britons that resistance is futile, but they've also created the conditions that make resistance inevitable. The rebel communication network operates through seemingly innocent activities. Merchants traveling between markets carry more than goods. They carry messages, reports on Roman troop movements, and updates on rebel preparations. Seasonal festivals become opportunities for tribal leaders to meet and coordinate their plans. Even marriage negotiations and funeral rites provide cover for military planning. The Romans begin to sense that something is wrong, but they systematically underestimate both the scale and the sophistication of what they're facing. Their intelligence sources are mostly Romanized Britons who have cut their ties to traditional tribal networks. Their military patrols follow predictable routes and schedules that make them easy to avoid. Most fatally, their cultural arrogance blinds them to the possibility that barbarian tribes could organize anything more sophisticated than cattle raids. Roman commanders in Britain also face a strategic distraction that works in the rebels' favor. Governor Suetonius Paulinus is campaigning in Wales, trying to complete the conquest of the last independent British territories. Most of his veteran troops are with him, leaving the rest of the province defended by skeleton garrisons and auxiliary units of questionable loyalty. The rebels have chosen their moment perfectly. By midsummer, Boudica's rebellion is ready to begin. The coalition includes not just the Iceni and Trinovantes, but also elements from the Corieltauvi, Catuvellauni, and other tribes. The total force assembles gradually in the forests north of Camulodunum, where Roman patrols rarely venture, and where British scouts can provide early warning of any Roman response. The army that gathers is unlike anything Britain has seen before. There are professional warriors carrying expensive weapons and wearing fine armor, but there are also farmers with hunting spears and kitchen knives. There are elderly druids who remember life before the conquest, and young people who have grown up under Roman rule but reject Roman values. There are entire families who have abandoned their homes to join the rebellion, bringing their livestock and possessions with them. This isn't just an army, it's a migration, a statement that the British people are willing to risk everything for the chance to reclaim their independence. The presence of so many non-combatants makes the force militarily unwieldy, but it also demonstrates the depth of popular support for the rebellion. These people aren't following Boudica because they've been conscripted or coerced. They're following her because they believe in what she represents. Women warriors paint their faces with woad and carry spears handed down from their grandmothers. Children too young to fight help tend the cooking fires and care for the animals. Craftsmen bring their tools alongside their weapons, understanding that victory will require rebuilding as well as destroying. Merchants abandon their profitable trade routes to join a cause that may cost them everything they've accumulated over decades of careful business. The diversity of the force is both its strength and its weakness. These people come from dozens of different tribes with their own customs, dialects, and traditional rivalries. Some worship different gods, follow different laws, and have fought wars against each other within living memory. Welding them into a unified fighting force requires all of Boudica's diplomatic skills and more patience than anyone has a right to expect from people whose families have been brutalized by Roman administrators. Yet somehow, it works. The shared experience of Roman oppression proves stronger than tribal differences. The common enemy provides a focus that overrides ancient feuds, and Boudica herself becomes a symbol that transcends tribal boundaries. Not just the queen of the Iceni, but the embodiment of British resistance to foreign domination. The final war council takes place in a sacred grove on the night before the attack on Camulodunum. Boudica stands before the assembled chiefs and druids, no longer the diplomatic client queen who once negotiated carefully with Roman administrators. The woman who speaks to them has been transformed by suffering into something harder and more focused. Not a politician seeking the best possible compromise, but a warrior demanding total victory or total destruction. Her speech, as recorded by later historians, is brief and devastating. She reminds her followers of what they've lost under Roman rule: their freedom, their dignity, their sacred sites, their children's futures. She speaks of the choice they face: die as slaves or live as free people. She promises that the gods are watching and that their ancestors will judge them by their courage in this moment. But perhaps most importantly, she speaks about fear, not the fear of death, which is natural and manageable, but the fear of continuing to live without honor or hope. We have endured 20 years of humiliation, she tells them. We have watched our children learn to bow to foreign masters. We have stood by while our sacred places were destroyed and our customs mocked. The question is not whether we can defeat Rome. The question is whether we can live with ourselves if we don't try. The response is electric. Warriors who have served under different chiefs for their entire lives suddenly see themselves as part of something larger. Tribal differences that seemed insurmountable yesterday become irrelevant in the face of tomorrow's opportunity. The assembled army doesn't just agree to follow Boudica. They embrace her as the leader they've been waiting for without knowing it. The attack on Camulodunum begins before dawn on a summer morning when the air is still cool and the dew lies heavy on the grass. Boudica's forces have moved into position during the night, surrounding the Roman colony in a loose circle that tightens gradually as the sun rises. The defenders, such as they are, have no warning of what's coming. Picture the scene as a Roman veteran wakes in his comfortable villa. built on land that once belonged to a British family driven away 20 years ago. He's perhaps 60 years old, a former legionary who served his 25 years and earned his citizenship and his plot of confiscated territory. His morning routine includes checking on his British slaves, local people who once owned this very land but now work it for his benefit. This morning is different. The usual sounds are wrong. No birds singing, no cattle lowing, no British workers beginning their dawn chores. The veteran is a trained soldier, and his instincts tell him something is amiss. He reaches for his sword, ceremonial now, barely sharp enough to cut bread, and steps outside to see the horizon dark with moving figures. The sight that greets him defies comprehension at first. What appears to be the entire countryside is in motion, flowing toward the settlement like a human tide. Chariots race ahead of the main force, their bronze-fitted wheels catching the early morning light. Behind them comes wave after wave of warriors on foot, their spears forming a bristling forest of iron points, their shields painted with the symbols of tribes that have been enemies for generations, but now march as one. The veteran's trained eye takes in details that would escape a civilian. The organization behind the apparent chaos. The way different tribal contingents maintain their formations while advancing together. The presence of women and children who suggest this isn't just a raid but something far more serious. This is a migration in arms, an entire people moving with purpose and fury toward his comfortable colonial outpost. He shouts a warning, but his voice is lost in the growing thunder of approaching feet and wheels. Other colonists emerge from their villas, rubbing sleep from their eyes, trying to understand what their neighbor is yelling about. Some are veterans like himself who immediately grasp the situation. Others are merchants and administrators who have never seen anything more violent than a tavern brawl. All of them are about to discover what 20 years of accumulated British resentment looks like when it finally finds its voice. The attack, when it comes, is swift and overwhelming. Boudica's warriors pour through the streets of Camulodunum like floodwater through a broken dam. There's no organized resistance because there's nothing to organize. Just scattered civilians and a handful of retired soldiers trying to remember 20-year-old training with weapons they haven't seriously maintained in decades. The sound is tremendous. Not just the clash of weapons and the shouting of warriors, but the deeper rumble of a world being turned upside down. Buildings that have stood for decades crumble in minutes. Carefully maintained gardens are trampled underfoot. The symbols of Roman civilization that the colonists have spent 20 years creating are swept away in a tide of British fury that has been building for just as long. But this isn't random destruction. Boudica's forces move with purpose, targeting specific buildings and symbols while sparing others. The tax collector's office burns first, along with all the records it contains. The courthouse where British disputes have been judged according to Roman law is demolished stone by stone. The market stalls where Roman merchants have grown rich selling British goods back to their original owners are reduced to kindling. Yet the granaries where food is stored are left intact. This army includes thousands of non-combatants who will need those supplies. The workshops where British craftsmen have been forced to produce goods for Roman export are preserved, though their Roman overseers flee or die. Even some private homes are spared if their owners can prove they've treated their British workers and neighbors with basic decency. The Roman colonists run for the Temple of Claudius, the massive stone building that dominates the town center. It's the most defensible structure in the settlement, with thick walls and a single entrance that can be barricaded. But it's also a symbol of everything the rebels hate. A shrine to a dead Roman emperor built with British labor on British land, maintained by British taxes and British forced labor. The temple represents more than just Roman religious practice. It embodies the systematic humiliation that has defined British life under Roman rule. Every stone was quarried by British hands under Roman supervision. Every column was carved by British craftsmen following Roman designs. Every decoration was paid for with taxes extracted from British farmers and traders. And all of it honors a man who never set foot in Britain, but claimed ownership of everything in it. The siege of the temple lasts 2 days, not because the building is particularly defensible, but because Boudica wants to make a statement. She could storm the temple immediately and slaughter everyone inside, but that would make her no different from Roman commanders who solve problems through simple brutality. Instead, she offers the defenders a choice: surrender and be exiled from Britain, or remain and face the consequences of their complicity in 20 years of oppression. The negotiations that follow reveal the complex moral landscape of colonial rule. Some of the colonists are genuine villains. Tax farmers who have grown rich through extortion, slave dealers who have trafficked in British children, administrators who have participated enthusiastically in the systematic humiliation of British leaders. These men have no illusions about what surrender might mean, and they choose to fight knowing that death is preferable to the justice they would face. But others are more complicated figures. Veterans who served their time and accepted land grants without questioning how that land was obtained. Merchants who traded fairly within an unfair system. Craftsmen who came to Britain seeking opportunities and found themselves part of an occupying force without intending to become oppressors. These people face impossible choices between abandoning everything they've built and defending actions they're not sure they can justify. Most choose to remain, whether from courage, stubbornness, or simply the recognition that exile means abandoning everything they've built their lives around. The temple becomes their tomb, but it burns slowly, methodically, with a deliberation that speaks to purposes beyond simple revenge. Each stone that cracks in the heat represents a piece of Roman authority crumbling. Each timber that collapses represents a British sacred grove that was cut down to build Roman monuments. The fire that consumes the temple burns for 3 days and nights, visible from miles away. It sends a column of smoke into the sky that can be seen from other Roman settlements, other British villages, other places where people are watching and waiting to see whether this rebellion is real or just another failed uprising that will be crushed within weeks. But this fire is different from the random destruction that typically follows military victory. Boudica's forces tend it carefully, feeding it with specific materials chosen for their symbolic value. Roman legal documents burn alongside carved statues of Roman gods. Tax records fuel flames that consume imperial portraits. The very symbols of Roman authority in Britain are systematically reduced to ash and memory. The destruction of Camulodunum takes 3 days to complete, not because the rebels are inefficient, but because they're thorough. Every Roman building is systematically dismantled. Every symbol of Roman authority is ground to dust. Every record of Roman legal decisions, tax assessments, and property transfers goes up in smoke. The rebels aren't just destroying a town. They're erasing 20 years of Roman administrative history, but they're also careful about what they preserve. British slaves are freed but not harmed. Craftsmen who served the Romans under duress are offered places in Boudica's forces. Even some Roman citizens who can prove they treated their British neighbors fairly are allowed to leave unharmed. This isn't mindless destruction, but selective justice, removing Roman authority while preserving whatever human decency can be salvaged. The liberation of British slaves becomes a powerful symbol of the rebellion's larger purposes. These are people who once owned the very land where they now work as property, families separated by Roman slave dealers, children who have grown up knowing only servitude. Their freedom represents not just individual liberation, but the restoration of proper relationships between people and the land that sustains them. Some of these newly freed slaves join Boudica's army immediately, eager to fight the system that has brutalized them. Others are too broken by years of abuse to trust any promise of freedom, and they must be convinced slowly that their liberation is real and permanent. Still others are simply overwhelmed by the sudden change in their circumstances, and need time to understand what freedom might mean for people who have lived as property for decades. The systematic destruction continues with an efficiency that speaks to months of careful planning. Special teams target specific types of buildings and records. The archives where property transfers are recorded burn first, eliminating legal justification for Roman land seizures. The armories are emptied of weapons that are distributed to newly recruited warriors. The granaries are inventoried and their contents allocated to feed the growing rebel army. Even the sewers and aqueducts receive attention, not for destruction, but for intelligence gathering. Roman engineers have built these systems with typical thoroughness, and understanding their layout provides valuable information about how other Roman settlements might be defended or attacked. The rebellion is learning from each victory, gathering knowledge that will prove useful in future operations. The psychological impact of Camulodunum's fall extends far beyond the immediate military victory. For 20 years, Roman colonists throughout Britain have lived with the comfortable assumption that their authority was permanent and their safety guaranteed. The destruction of an entire Roman settlement by British forces challenges every assumption about the balance of power in the province. Roman merchants who have grown rich exploiting British resources suddenly find themselves questioning whether their wealth makes them targets. Roman administrators who have built careers on the assumption of permanent Roman dominance begin quietly preparing escape plans. Even Roman soldiers in garrison towns start looking over their shoulders, wondering whether their British auxiliary comrades can really be trusted. But perhaps the most significant impact is on British communities that have accommodated themselves to Roman rule. For 2 decades, tribal leaders have been told that resistance is futile, that Roman power is irresistible, that the best they can hope for is to find comfortable positions within the imperial system. The destruction of Camulodunum proves that Roman power has limits, that resistance is possible, that accommodation may not be the only viable strategy. News of Camulodunum's destruction spreads across Britain faster than Boudicca's army can march. Roman settlements that seemed secure yesterday suddenly feel vulnerable. British communities that have accepted Roman rule for decades begin quietly celebrating. The psychological impact is enormous. If Camulodunum can fall, nowhere is truly safe. Tribal councils that have spent years debating whether to resist Roman encroachment suddenly find themselves discussing when and how to join Boudicca's rebellion. Warriors who have served in Roman auxiliary units begin deserting to join British forces. Even some Roman citizens of British descent start quietly supporting the rebellion while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to Rome. The Roman administrative apparatus in Britain begins to crack under the strain. Officials who have spent years building careers on the assumption of permanent Roman dominance suddenly find themselves questioning their most basic assumptions. Auxiliary troops recruited from British tribes begin deserting in significant numbers. Even some Roman citizens begin quietly preparing to flee the province. Communication networks that have taken decades to establish start breaking down as British couriers abandon their posts and Roman officials lose confidence in their ability to maintain contact with distant settlements. Trade routes that have generated enormous profits for Roman merchants become too dangerous to travel. The entire economic and political structure of Roman Britain begins to unravel with stunning speed. But perhaps the most significant impact is on British communities that haven't yet joined the rebellion. For 20 years, they've been told that resistance is futile, that Roman power is irresistible, that accommodation is the only realistic option. The destruction of Camulodunum proves that Roman power has limits, that resistance is possible, that the choice between freedom and slavery is still meaningful. Tribal ambassadors begin arriving at Boudicca's camp in increasing numbers. Some come from communities that have been planning to join the rebellion all along. Others represent groups that have only now decided the risk of resistance is less than the certainty of continued oppression. Still others are simply trying to position themselves advantageously in case the rebellion succeeds. Each new group that joins brings its own strengths and complications. More warriors mean more military power, but also more mouths to feed and more opinions to consider in strategic planning. More territory under rebel control provides resources and sanctuary, but also requires defenders and administrators. The rebellion is growing so quickly that its leaders sometimes struggle to keep track of their own forces. The tribal diversity of Boudicca's growing army creates both opportunities and challenges. Ancient rivalries between different groups must be managed carefully to prevent the coalition from fragmenting. Different military traditions must be coordinated to create effective fighting units. Various dialects and customs must be accommodated while maintaining overall discipline and coherence. Yet somehow, the diversity becomes a source of strength rather than weakness. Warriors who have spent their lives fighting neighboring tribes discover that they share common grievances against Roman rule. Craftsmen from different regions exchange techniques and knowledge that improve the rebellion's equipment and logistics. Even ancient tribal feuds begin to seem petty compared to the shared goal of driving out the foreign occupiers. News of Camulodunum's destruction spreads across Britain faster than Boudicca's army can march. Roman settlements that seemed secure yesterday suddenly feel vulnerable. British communities that have accepted Roman rule for decades begin quietly celebrating. The psychological impact is enormous. If Camulodunum can fall, nowhere is truly safe. The Roman administrative apparatus in Britain begins to crack under the strain. Officials who have spent years building careers on the assumption of permanent Roman dominance suddenly find themselves questioning their most basic assumptions. Auxiliary troops recruited from British tribes begin deserting in significant numbers. Even some Roman citizens begin quietly preparing to flee the province. But perhaps the most significant impact is on British communities that haven't yet joined the rebellion. For 20 years, they've been told that resistance is futile, that Roman power is irresistible, that accommodation is the only realistic option. The destruction of Camulodunum proves that Roman power has limits, that resistance is possible, that the choice between freedom and slavery is still meaningful. Tribal ambassadors begin arriving at Boudica's camp in increasing numbers. Some come from communities that have been planning to join the rebellion all along. Others represent groups that have only now decided the risk of resistance is less than the certainty of continued oppression. Still others are simply trying to position themselves advantageously in case the rebellion succeeds. Each new group that joins brings its own strengths and complications. More warriors mean more military power, but also more mouths to feed and more opinions to consider in strategic planning. More territory under rebel control provides resources and sanctuary, but also requires defenders and administrators. The rebellion is growing so quickly that its leaders sometimes struggle to keep track of their own forces. Boudica's next target is Londinium, London, the commercial heart of Roman Britain. This isn't yet the great city it will become, but it's already the most important trading center in the province. Roman merchants use it as a base for extracting British wealth and shipping it to Rome. British collaborators use it as a source of Roman luxuries and status symbols. It represents everything wrong with the Roman economic system that has impoverished ordinary Britons while enriching foreign exploiters. The march from Camulodunum to London takes several days, and it becomes a kind of triumphal procession in reverse. Instead of a conquering Roman general displaying captured enemies and looted treasure, it's a British queen leading her people toward the liberation of their own land. Villages and farmsteads along the route empty as their inhabitants join the growing column of rebels. The army that approaches London is larger than the one that destroyed Camulodunum, but it's also more unwieldy. Families have joined the column, bringing their livestock and possessions with them. Craftsmen carry their tools alongside their weapons. Children too young to fight march beside warriors preparing for battle. This is no longer just a military force. It's become a migration of people who have decided to risk everything on the possibility of freedom. The logistics of moving such a massive group become increasingly complex. Food must be found for tens of thousands of people and their animals. Campsites must be selected that can accommodate the entire host while providing some security against Roman counterattacks. Discipline must be maintained among warriors from dozens of different tribes, each with their own customs and chain of command. Yet the march continues with surprising efficiency, testament to the organizational skills that Boudica and her war chiefs have developed over months of careful planning. Supply trains organized by tribal specialists keep the army fed. Scout networks provide advance warning of Roman movements. Communication systems ensure that orders reach even the most distant elements of the force. Roman scouts bring word of the approaching army to Governor Suetonius Paulinus, who is still campaigning in Wales. He faces an agonizing decision: abandon his Welsh campaign and rush back to defend London, or allow the rebels to take the city while he completes the conquest of the last independent British territories. From a purely military standpoint, the choice is obvious. London can be rebuilt, but the opportunity to finish the Welsh campaign may not come again for years. Suetonius makes the hard choice. He sends word that London should be evacuated but not defended. The civilian population should flee to safer territories while his army completes its current mission. It's a decision that makes perfect strategic sense but abandons thousands of Roman citizens and British collaborators to whatever mercy Boudica chooses to show. When Boudica's army arrives at London, they find a city in chaos. Some residents have heeded the evacuation order and fled north toward Roman military bases. Others have stayed to defend their property or because they have nowhere else to go. Still others are simply paralyzed by the speed with which their world has turned upside down. The city that greets the rebels is the distillation of everything they hate about Roman rule. The warehouses are packed with goods extracted from British territories and destined for export to Rome. Grain that should feed British families, metals that should equip British craftsmen, luxury items that represent the fruits of British labor, sold back to the British at inflated prices. The merchant houses display wealth that dwarfs anything most British nobles have ever possessed, built on the systematic exploitation of British resources. But there's also something else. evidence of the cultural transformation that Rome has been imposing on Britain. British slaves speak Latin better than their native languages. British craftsmen produce goods in Roman styles for Roman markets. British children learn Roman history while forgetting their own traditions. The systematic destruction of British identity is laid bare in the very layout of the city. The destruction of London takes longer than Camulodunum's fall, not because of resistance, but because of the sheer scale of Roman wealth accumulated there. Warehouses full of goods burn for days. The forums and bathhouses require careful demolition to ensure they can't be quickly rebuilt. The administrative buildings must be emptied of records before being destroyed. Some documents are valuable intelligence about Roman plans and resources. Others are simply evidence of Roman crimes that should be preserved for posterity. But amidst all this destruction, there are moments of unexpected mercy that reveal the complexity of Boudicca's character and motivations. A Roman merchant who has treated his British workers fairly is allowed to leave with his family and personal possessions. A British woman married to a Roman citizen is given safe passage to reunite with her children in Gaul. Even some Roman officials who can demonstrate they oppose the worst abuses of the system are permitted to depart unharmed. These aren't random acts of kindness, but calculated decisions that serve Boudicca's larger purposes. She wants to demonstrate that her rebellion is about justice, not just revenge. She wants to show that Romans who respect British rights can coexist with British independence. Most importantly, she wants to prove that British rule can be more merciful than Roman rule, that liberation doesn't require adopting the oppressor's methods. At the same time, those who have profited most directly from British suffering receive no mercy. Tax farmers who have grown rich collecting tribute beyond legal limits are executed. Slave dealers who have trafficked in British children are killed. Roman officials who have participated in the systematic humiliation of British leaders face the same degradation they once imposed on others. The burning of London continues for a week, sending columns of smoke into the sky that can be seen for dozens of miles in every direction. It's a signal visible across southern Britain that the old order is collapsing, that Roman authority has limits, that the British people have found the courage to reclaim their freedom. But it's also a warning to Rome that this rebellion is different from previous British uprisings, more organized, more determined, and more dangerous to the foundations of Roman rule in Britain. While London burns, Boudicca's scouts and spies are gathering intelligence about Roman military movements throughout Britain. The news is both encouraging and alarming. Encouraging because most Roman forces are still tied up in Wales with Governor Suetonius, leaving the rest of the province largely undefended. Alarming because those forces in Wales are veteran legions with experience fighting British tribes, and they're already beginning to move toward the rebellion's territory. The rebels also intercept Roman communications that reveal the empire's long-term plans for Britain. Documents found in government offices confirm what many have suspected. Rome intends to eliminate all vestiges of British independence, replace traditional leaders with Roman administrators, and systematically destroy British culture in favor of Roman civilization. The rebellion isn't just fighting current abuses, it's fighting for the survival of British identity itself. This intelligence allows Boudicca to make her next strategic decision. She could attempt to hold London against the inevitable Roman counterattack, turning the city into a fortress and forcing the Romans to conduct a costly siege. Or she could continue her offensive strategy, striking at additional targets while Roman forces are still scattered and disorganized. Given the mobility advantages her forces enjoy and the questionable loyalty of British auxiliaries in Roman service, the offensive option seems more promising. The third major target is Verulamium, modern St. Albans, a city that represents something different from Camulodunum or London. This isn't a Roman colony or a commercial center, but a municipium, a British settlement that has been granted Roman legal status and has chosen to adopt Roman customs wholesale. The population is primarily British, but they've abandoned their traditional ways of life in favor of Roman law, Roman architecture, Roman education, and Roman religion. To Boudicca's followers, Verulamium represents the most insidious form of Roman conquest, not military occupation, but cultural assimilation. The people there have voluntarily surrendered their British identity in exchange for Roman privileges. They've become Roman in everything but blood, and some of them have become more aggressively Roman than actual Romans in their eagerness to prove their loyalty to the empire. The march to Verulamium becomes another opportunity for the rebellion to demonstrate its growing strength and support. Communities along the route compete to show their enthusiasm for Boudica's cause. Warriors from previously neutral tribes join the column. Local leaders who have maintained careful neutrality for 20 years suddenly discover their commitment to British independence. But the growing size of the rebel army creates new challenges. Feeding tens of thousands of people requires careful organization and significant resources. Maintaining discipline among warriors from dozens of different tribes requires constant attention from Boudica and her war chiefs. Most importantly, the presence of so many non-combatants, families, craftsmen, merchants, elderly supporters, makes military maneuvers slow and cumbersome. These aren't necessarily fatal weaknesses, but they're constraints that will become important when the rebels finally face professional Roman opposition. Boudica's forces can overwhelm lightly defended settlements and scattered Roman patrols, but they're becoming less capable of the rapid movement and tactical flexibility that gave them their initial advantages. When Boudica's army appears outside Verulamium, the city's response reveals the psychological complexity of life under Roman rule. Some residents immediately open the gates and welcome the rebels as liberators. Others barricade themselves in their Roman-style villas and prepare to defend their adopted lifestyle. Still others simply flee, unwilling to choose between their British heritage and their Roman privileges. The siege of Verulamium, such as it is, becomes a negotiation as much as a military operation. Boudica offers amnesty to any Briton willing to renounce Roman citizenship and return to traditional ways of life. She promises safety to Roman citizens who agree to leave Britain permanently. She even extends limited protection to mixed families where British and Roman traditions have become intertwined through marriage or adoption. But she also makes clear that the systematic abandonment of British culture in favor of Roman civilization cannot continue. The municipium of Verulamium represents everything her rebellion opposes: the voluntary surrender of British identity, the eager adoption of the oppressor's values, the transformation of proud tribal warriors into eager provincial subjects. This kind of cultural surrender is, in her view, more dangerous than military conquest because it destroys resistance from within. The fall of Verulamium is less violent than the destruction of Camulodunum or London, but it's more psychologically devastating for Rome. Military defeats can be avenged, and commercial losses can be recouped, but the collapse of a supposedly loyal British community raises questions about the fundamental stability of Roman rule in Britain. If the Britons of Verulamium can abandon their Roman identity overnight, what does that say about British loyalty elsewhere in the province? By the late summer of 60 CE, Boudica controls most of southeastern Britain. 3 major settlements have fallen to her forces. Roman authority has collapsed across vast areas of the province. The rebellion has attracted support from tribes that have never before cooperated with each other. For the first time since the Roman invasion began, British independence seems achievable rather than merely hopeful. But the Romans are finally beginning to respond with the systematic efficiency that has built their empire. Governor Suetonius abandons his Welsh campaign and begins concentrating his forces for a decisive confrontation with the rebellion. Reinforcements are summoned from other provinces. Auxiliary units of questionable loyalty are disbanded or transferred away from areas where they might defect to Boudica's cause. Most importantly, the Romans begin to understand what they're facing. This isn't a typical tribal uprising that can be crushed through superior military technology and professional discipline. It's a popular rebellion with deep roots in legitimate grievances, sophisticated organization, and capable leadership. Defeating it will require not just military victory, but a fundamental reconsideration of how Rome governs its British subjects. The intelligence war intensifies as both sides try to anticipate their enemy's next moves. Roman spies attempt to infiltrate Boudica's forces and assess their capabilities. British scouts track Roman military movements and try to identify weaknesses in their deployment. Both sides spread propaganda designed to undermine their enemy's morale and encourage defections. As autumn approaches, both sides prepare for what everyone recognizes will be the decisive confrontation of the rebellion. Boudica's forces have grown to enormous size. Ancient sources claim over 100,000 warriors, though such numbers should be treated skeptically. Even allowing for exaggeration, the rebels clearly outnumber any Roman force that can be assembled against them. But numbers aren't everything in ancient warfare. Roman soldiers are professionals who have trained together for years and fought as units across the empire. They have superior equipment, better medical support, and more sophisticated logistics. Most importantly, they have experience fighting as disciplined formations rather than as individual warriors or small tribal bands. Boudica and her war chiefs understand these disadvantages, but they also recognize their own advantages. They're fighting on familiar territory against an enemy far from home. They have the support of the local population and knowledge of every road, river, and forest in their territory. They're fighting for their homes and families while the Romans are fighting for abstract concepts like imperial prestige and provincial taxation. The strategic question becomes whether Boudica can force a battle on terms that favor British strengths while minimizing Roman advantages. She needs to find a way to use her superior numbers effectively while preventing the Romans from employing their superior discipline and equipment to maximum advantage. She needs to strike before Roman reinforcements arrive, but not so hastily that she wastes her current advantages. The last war council of the rebellion takes place in early autumn as the leaves begin to turn and the air carries the first hint of winter's approach. The assembled tribal leaders represent the largest coalition in British history. Dozens of tribes that have put aside generations of feuds and rivalries to unite against Roman rule. The Druids who bless their deliberations speak of omens that favor the righteous and gods who support those fighting for their homeland. But there's also tension in the council. Some chiefs argue for immediate attack before Roman forces can fully concentrate. Others advocate for a defensive strategy that would force the Romans to attack British positions. Still others suggest dividing the rebel army to strike multiple targets simultaneously, preventing the Romans from achieving decisive victory in a single battle. Boudica listens to all these arguments, but her final decision reflects both her strategic understanding and her psychological insight into what her followers need. The rebellion has succeeded through bold action and dramatic victories. Her people need to feel that they're advancing toward total liberation rather than merely defending what they've already gained. A defensive strategy might be militarily safer, but it would drain the rebellion's momentum and give Roman propaganda opportunities to portray the rebels as weakening. Her decision is to advance toward the Roman army and force a decisive battle, but to choose the ground carefully to maximize British advantages. The location she selects, whose exact identity historians still debate, is a valley that will limit the Romans' ability to maneuver while giving the rebels room to employ their superior numbers. It's a calculated gamble that everything can be won or lost in a single afternoon. The final battle of Boudica's rebellion takes place on a day when the autumn air is crisp and clear, when the morning mist rises from the valleys like the breath of sleeping gods. Both armies have been maneuvering for position for days, seeking the advantage that might determine not just the outcome of this single engagement, but the future of Roman rule in Britain. Governor Suetonius has chosen his ground with the careful precision of a chess master thinking several moves ahead. The battlefield is a narrow valley with forests on three sides, giving his smaller army natural protection against flanking attacks, while forcing Boudica's larger forces into a confined space where their numbers become a disadvantage rather than an asset. His men have their backs to the trees, eliminating any possibility of retreat and ensuring they'll fight with the desperate courage of soldiers who know survival depends on victory. Boudica's army approaches the Roman position with confidence born of months of unbroken success. They've destroyed 3 major settlements, scattered Roman forces across the province, and attracted support from tribes across Britain. Many of the warriors have never experienced defeat against Roman forces. Some have never seen Romans stand and fight rather than retreat or negotiate. The sight that greets them as they crest the ridge overlooking the battlefield must be both encouraging and sobering. Encouraging, because they vastly outnumber the enemy. The Roman force is perhaps 10,000 men facing what ancient sources claim is over 100,000 rebels. Sobering, because those Roman soldiers are arrayed in perfect formations, their shields overlapping, their spears at identical angles, their armor gleaming in the morning sun. The contrast between the two armies tells the story of the entire rebellion in visual form. Boudica's forces are a sea of individual warriors, each dressed according to his tribe's customs, carrying weapons that reflect personal taste and family heritage. There are young men with hunting spears, elderly veterans carrying swords inherited from their grandfathers, women warriors painted with woad, druids in white robes carrying ceremonial weapons blessed by ancient rituals. Facing them are Roman legionaries who look like products of a single workshop rather than individual human beings. Their equipment is standardized, their formations are identical, their movements are synchronized. They represent the industrial efficiency of imperial warfare, mass-produced soldiers created by a military system that has conquered most of the known world through superior organization rather than superior courage. The morning hours pass slowly as both armies prepare for combat that will determine the fate of Roman Britain. Boudica rides among her forces in her war chariot, her daughters beside her, inspecting the formations and speaking words of encouragement to warriors who have traveled hundreds of miles to stand on this field. The sight of their queen, scarred but unbroken, reminds every warrior why they're fighting and what victory might achieve. On the Roman side, centurions move through the ranks checking equipment and reminding their men of their training. These are professional soldiers who have fought in dozens of battles across the empire, but they've never faced odds like these. The weight of numbers arrayed against them is sobering even for veterans who have seen Germanic tribes charge Roman lines and watched Gaulish cavalry break against legionary shields. Before the battle begins, both commanders address their forces in speeches that reveal their very different understandings of what they're fighting for. Boudica rides her chariot along the front lines of her army, her daughters beside her, her voice carrying across the assembled tribes with words that Roman historians would later attempt to reconstruct from survivors' accounts. She speaks of freedom versus slavery, of dying as warriors versus living as subjects, of the choice between honoring their ancestors or betraying their children. She reminds her followers of 20 years of Roman abuse, of sacred groves destroyed and children enslaved, of taxes that impoverish British families to enrich Roman merchants. She points to her own scars, to her daughter's trauma, to the evidence of Roman brutality that stands before them in living form. But perhaps most powerfully, she speaks of the moment itself. How rarely in history people get the chance to choose their own fate, to write their own stories, to decide whether they'll be remembered as heroes or slaves. We have the numbers, she tells them. We have the righteousness. We have the support of our gods and our ancestors. The only question is whether we have the courage to claim what is already ours. On the Roman side, Suetonius gives a very different speech to his soldiers. He doesn't speak of abstract concepts like freedom or justice, but of practical realities like survival and victory. He reminds his men that they're facing undisciplined barbarians who have never fought professional soldiers in open battle. He points out that their enemies' numbers work against them in the confined space of the valley. He promises them that Roman discipline and Roman weapons will triumph over British enthusiasm and British numbers. Most importantly, he tells them that they're fighting not just for their own lives, but for the future of Roman civilization in Britain. If they lose, 20 years of Roman progress will be undone overnight. If they win, they'll be remembered as the soldiers who saved a province and preserved an empire. The choice, he tells them, is between eternal glory and immediate death. And for Roman soldiers, that's not really a choice at all. The fighting begins not with a dramatic charge, but with the kind of preliminary skirmishing that characterizes most ancient battles. British warriors advance in small groups, testing Roman defenses, trying to find weak points in the enemy line. Roman auxiliaries respond with volleys of javelins and arrows, seeking to disrupt British formations before the main assault begins. For perhaps an hour, the battle consists of this kind of probing and counter-probing, with neither side fully committed to decisive action. The Romans hold their positions with the patience of professional soldiers who understand that the enemy's enthusiasm will eventually overcome his caution. The Britons gradually work themselves into the psychological state necessary for the kind of all-out assault that has carried their previous victories. The sound of individual combat gives way to something larger and more terrible. The roar of tens of thousands of voices raised in war cries that have echoed across British battlefields for centuries. Druids chant invocations to gods whose names are older than Rome. Warriors beat their shields and weapons together in rhythms that their grandfathers learned from their grandfathers. The very air seems to vibrate with the accumulated fury of 20 years of oppression finally finding its outlet. When the main attack finally comes, it comes with a sound like thunder rolling across the valley. Tens of thousands of voices raised in war cries that have echoed across British battlefields for centuries. The thunder of hooves and running feet. The clash of weapons that can be heard for miles in every direction. For a moment, It seems as if the very earth is shaking under the weight of so much concentrated human fury. The initial British assault hits the Roman line like a wave hitting a seawall. Individual Roman soldiers disappear under masses of British warriors. Sections of the line bend backward under pressure that seems irresistible. For a few terrifying moments, it appears that sheer weight of numbers will carry the day regardless of discipline or training. Boudica herself leads from the front, her chariot wheels scattering Roman skirmishers as she races along the battle line. Her daughters fight beside her, spears in their hands, their faces painted with the blue woad that marks them as daughters of ancient gods. They embody everything the rebellion represents: British courage, British determination, British refusal to accept subjugation as permanent. But the Roman line holds. Barely and only just, but it holds. The soldiers who have trained together for years respond to crisis with automatic precision. Gaps in the line are filled instantly. Wounded men are dragged to safety without breaking formation. Officers relay orders with calm efficiency, even as British warriors climb over the bodies of their comrades to reach Roman positions. The confined space that was supposed to work in Boudica's favor begins to work against her instead. Her warriors, packed tightly together in the narrow valley, find themselves unable to maneuver effectively. Those in the rear continue pushing forward, while those in the front meet increasingly organized Roman resistance. The crush becomes so severe that many warriors can barely lift their weapons, much less use them effectively. And then, as British momentum begins to slow, the Romans counterattack, not with individual heroics or spontaneous charges, but with the coordinated precision that has made Roman legions feared from Britain to Syria. They advance as one, their shields locked together, their short swords thrusting in perfect unison. Where British warriors fight as individuals, Romans fight as a single organism with thousands of parts. The psychological impact is devastating. British warriors who have never faced serious reverse suddenly find themselves being pushed back by an enemy they outnumber 10-1. The confined space of the valley, which seemed like an advantage when they were advancing, becomes a trap when they need to retreat. Warriors in the rear continue pushing forward while those in the front try to fall back, creating a crush that makes organized resistance impossible. What happens next is not really a battle but a catastrophe. The British army doesn't retreat, it disintegrates. Warriors who have fought together for months suddenly lose contact with their leaders, their units, their sense of direction. The valley that was supposed to contain Roman forces instead becomes a killing ground where British numbers work against British survival. The Romans, professional soldiers to their core, recognize the moment when victory becomes inevitable and press their advantage with relentless efficiency. They advance steadily through the tangled mass of British warriors, their formations intact, their purpose clear. This isn't emotional vengeance, but systematic destruction designed to end the rebellion permanently. Ancient sources claim that 80,000 Britons died in the battle, while Roman losses numbered fewer than 1,000. Such figures are almost certainly exaggerated, but they reflect the scale of the disaster that befalls Boudica's forces. An entire generation of British resistance leaders is eliminated in a single afternoon. Families that followed the rebellion in hope of freedom are destroyed in the space of a few hours. Boudica herself survives the initial collapse of her army, but she watches from her chariot as everything she's worked for crumbles around her. The coalition she spent months building dissolves as tribal units break contact and flee toward their home territories. The cause she's fought for dies in the mud of an anonymous valley whose name will be forgotten while its significance echoes through centuries. Some accounts say she takes poison rather than face capture, choosing to die as a free queen rather than live as a Roman prisoner. Others suggest she succumbs to wounds or illness in the aftermath of the battle. Still others claim she simply vanishes into the forests of Britain, becoming legend rather than remaining history. Perhaps the exact manner of her death matters less than its symbolic meaning. The end of the last serious British resistance to Roman rule for 3.5 centuries. The survivors of the battle scatter across Britain, carrying with them stories of heroism and tragedy that will be told around hearthfires for generations. Some manage to reach the territory of tribes that remained neutral, where they're absorbed into communities that had the wisdom or good fortune to avoid involvement in the rebellion. Others flee to the most remote areas of Scotland or Ireland, beyond the reach of Roman revenge, but also beyond the protection of organized society. The Roman response is swift and brutal. Villages suspected of supporting the rebellion are burned. Tribal leaders who showed sympathy for Boudicca's cause are executed or exiled. The remaining population of southeastern Britain is subjected to collective punishment, designed to ensure that no similar uprising ever occurs. It's the kind of systematic retaliation that Roman military doctrine prescribes for serious rebellions, harsh enough to discourage future resistance, thorough enough to eliminate potential leaders. But there are also signs that the rebellion has forced changes in Roman policy toward Britain. New administrators are appointed with instructions to govern more sensitively. Some of the worst abuses that triggered Boudicca's revolt are quietly corrected. The systematic exploitation that characterized early Roman rule is replaced by more sustainable policies that give British communities some stake in the imperial system. The defeat of Boudicca's rebellion marks the end of British independence for nearly 4 centuries. No subsequent uprising will come close to achieving the success of her coalition, and no British leader will again unite so many tribes against Roman rule. From a political standpoint, the rebellion is a complete failure that simply delays the inevitable complete integration of Britain into the Roman Empire. But from a cultural standpoint, the impact is more complex. The rebellion demonstrates that British identity is strong enough to survive military conquest and administrative absorption. The fact that so many tribes were willing to risk everything for the chance of independence proves that Roman cultural influence, impressive as it is, hasn't completely displaced British traditions and values. The stories of Boudicca's courage spread throughout the Celtic world, inspiring resistance movements in Gaul, Ireland, and Scotland. Roman writers, grudgingly respectful of her leadership abilities, preserve accounts of her rebellion that ensure her memory survives the destruction of her cause. She becomes proof that even the mightiest empire can be challenged, that even the most hopeless resistance can achieve a kind of victory through the simple act of refusing to surrender. And so we come to the part of every story that reaches furthest into our hearts, not the ending, but the beginning of memory. Boudicca's rebellion lasted perhaps 6 months from the first stirrings of resistance to the final collapse on that unnamed battlefield. 6 months against an empire that would endure for centuries. By any practical measure, she failed so completely that her defeat became a cautionary tale about the futility of challenging Roman power. Yet, here we are, nearly 2,000 years later, and her name echoes, while the names of her Roman enemies fade into footnotes. Children in British schools learn about her courage alongside lessons about Julius Caesar and Augustus. Statues of her stand in London, not far from where her warriors once burned Roman warehouses to the ground. Her story has become proof that some defeats are more enduring than victory, that some failures achieve more than success ever could. In the months following the battle, Roman administrators work methodically to erase every trace of the rebellion from official records. The cities Boudicca burned are rebuilt with Roman efficiency, their new layouts designed to prevent the kind of rapid assault that destroyed the originals. The tribal territories that supported her are reorganized under direct Roman control, their traditional leaders replaced by administrators appointed from Rome. But memory is harder to control than territory, and the story of Boudicca's rebellion spreads through ways that Roman authority cannot easily reach. British slaves in Roman households whisper tales of the queen who fought back. Merchants traveling between provinces carry accounts of her victories along with their more conventional goods. Even Roman soldiers, grudgingly respectful of an enemy who fought with such determination, share stories of her courage in taverns across the empire. The Druids, those keepers of Celtic memory who somehow survive Roman persecution, weave Boudicca's story into their oral traditions alongside the ancient tales of gods and heroes. She becomes part of a continuum that stretches back to the beginning of British time, another link in the chain of those who chose honor over safety, resistance over submission. Her daughters, whose names history hasn't preserved, become symbols of innocence violated and courage inherited. Even Roman writers, trained to celebrate imperial victories and minimize the achievements of Rome's enemies, find themselves drawn to Boudicca's story. Tacitus, writing perhaps 50 years after her death, describes her with a mixture of respect and regret that suggests the rebellion left deeper marks on Roman consciousness than official accounts would suggest. He writes of her intelligence, her charismatic leadership, her ability to unite traditionally fractious British tribes under a single banner. He acknowledges that Roman administrative abuses triggered legitimate grievances that any reasonable person would resist. Most remarkably, He suggests that her rebellion, though unsuccessful, served a valuable purpose by forcing Rome to examine and reform its policies toward conquered peoples. This Roman reassessment of the rebellion reflects a broader evolution in imperial ideology. The early empire, confident in its military superiority and cultural supremacy, had governed through fear and force with little concern for local sensibilities. Boudica's rebellion, along with similar uprisings in other provinces, demonstrates that such methods create more problems than they solve. Later, Roman administrators adopt subtler approaches that give conquered peoples some stake in the imperial system while preserving essential Roman authority. They learn to work with local elites rather than replacing them entirely, to accommodate local customs rather than suppressing them completely, to govern through incentives rather than relying solely on threats. As the immediate trauma of the rebellion fades into historical memory, Boudica herself begins to transform from historical figure into mythological symbol. British storytellers, no longer constrained by the need for political caution, begin embellishing her story with supernatural elements that reflect their understanding of her significance. She becomes the queen who spoke with gods, whose chariot wheels left permanent marks in British stone, whose voice could be heard in the wind when injustice needed to be challenged. Ancient British tales describe her as the mother of the land itself, a figure who emerges whenever the British people face their darkest hours to remind them that resistance is always possible. These mythological elaborations aren't historical distortions, but psychological truths about what Boudica represents to successive generations of British people. She embodies the principle that some things matter more than survival, that dignity has value even when resistance seems hopeless, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The Romans, despite their military victory, find it difficult to counter this growing legend. They can control territory and tax collection, but they cannot control the stories people tell their children or the heroes they choose to remember. Boudica's memory becomes a form of resistance that no amount of military force can eliminate. During the medieval period, when Roman rule has long since collapsed and Britain faces new waves of invasion and conquest, Boudica's story takes on new meanings. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, themselves descended from invaders who conquered post-Roman Britain, find in her tale a warning about the limits of foreign rule and the persistence of native resistance. Medieval Welsh and Irish writers, maintaining Celtic traditions that predate Roman conquest, preserve and elaborate Boudica's story as part of their cultural resistance to Norman rule. She becomes proof that Celtic peoples have always fought against foreign domination, that their defeats are temporary setbacks rather than permanent surrenders. The medieval church, initially suspicious of pagan British heroes, gradually incorporates Boudica into Christian narratives as an example of righteous resistance to tyrannical authority. Her rebellion becomes a prefiguration of Christian martyrdom, her willingness to sacrifice everything for principles seen as anticipating the spiritual courage demanded by faith. The Renaissance brings renewed interest in classical sources and historical accuracy, leading to more scholarly examination of Boudica's actual rebellion rather than its mythological elaborations. Humanist scholars study Tacitus and other Roman historians, attempting to understand what really happened during those crucial months when British independence seemed achievable. But this scholarly approach doesn't diminish Boudica's symbolic power. It enhances it by grounding her legend in documented historical reality. Renaissance writers can now point to specific Roman sources that confirm her existence, her achievements, and her ultimate sacrifice. She becomes not just a mythological figure, but a historically verified example of principled resistance to tyranny. The Protestant Reformation gives Boudica's story yet another layer of meaning as English writers begin using her as a symbol of resistance to foreign religious authority. Just as she fought against Roman political domination, Protestant polemicists argue, the English people must resist papal spiritual domination. Her rebellion becomes a precedent for challenging any authority that demands submission to foreign rule. This religious interpretation of Boudica's story reflects the complex ways that historical memory adapts to contemporary political needs. Each generation finds in her tale the elements that speak most directly to their own struggles and aspirations. The specific details of her actual rebellion matter less than the enduring principles her story represents. Elizabeth I's court poets explicitly compare the Virgin Queen to the ancient British warrior queen, drawing parallels between their resistance to foreign domination and their determination to preserve English independence. Boudica becomes part of the mythological foundation of English nationalism, proof that resistance to empire is itself an ancient English tradition. Enlightenment historians approach Boudica's story with new analytical tools, attempting to understand the economic and social forces that drove her rebellion rather than simply celebrating or condemning her actions. They examine the taxation policies that triggered British resentment, the administrative abuses that made Roman rule unbearable, the military imbalances that made rebellion both necessary and doomed. This more sophisticated analysis doesn't diminish Boudica's heroic status, but places it in a broader context of historical causation. She becomes not just an individual hero, but a representative figure whose actions illuminate the broader dynamics of conquest, resistance, and cultural change. Her rebellion becomes a case study in the limits of imperial power and the persistence of local identity. Enlightenment writers also begin examining the gender dimensions of Boudica's story, noting how her female leadership challenges conventional assumptions about political authority and military command. She becomes evidence that leadership ability isn't determined by gender, that women can be just as effective as men in organizing resistance and inspiring followers. The Victorian era brings perhaps the most dramatic reinterpretation of Boudica's legacy, as British writers grapple with the moral contradictions of their own empire. How can a nation that celebrates Boudica's resistance to Roman imperialism simultaneously justify its own imperial expansion across Africa, Asia, and the Americas? Some Victorian writers resolve this contradiction by arguing that British imperialism is fundamentally different from Roman conquest, more benevolent, more civilizing, more respectful of local customs. They portray Boudica as fighting against a brutal form of ancient imperialism that modern British rule has transcended through enlightened administration and Christian values. Others use Boudica's story as a critique of imperialism itself, arguing that her rebellion demonstrates the universal human desire for self-determination and the ultimate futility of ruling unwilling subjects. These writers see in her tale a warning about the costs of empire and a reminder that even the mightiest powers must eventually face the resistance of those they seek to dominate. The famous statue of Boudica that stands near Westminster Bridge in London, erected during the Victorian period, captures this complex relationship with her legacy. She's portrayed as a fierce warrior defending her children and her land, but she's also positioned to look out over the Thames toward the Houses of Parliament, simultaneously celebrating ancient British resistance and modern British power. The 20th century's experience of total war and resistance movements gives Boudica's story new relevance and poignancy. During World War II, when Britain itself faces invasion and conquest, her example provides inspiration for those preparing to resist Nazi occupation. Underground resistance networks study her tactics. Propaganda posters invoke her memory. She becomes proof that Britain has always found ways to fight back against seemingly overwhelming enemies. The decolonization movements that follow the war also find inspiration in Boudica's rebellion. Leaders fighting for independence from British rule sometimes invoke her example, pointing out the irony that Britain once produced its own anti-imperial hero. Her story becomes universal, speaking to anyone who has ever faced the choice between submission and resistance. Feminist historians reclaim Boudica as an early example of female leadership and courage, challenging traditional narratives that marginalize women's roles in political and military history. They examine how her gender both complicated and enhanced her effectiveness as a leader, how she used maternal imagery to justify her rebellion while demonstrating capabilities that transcend traditional gender roles. Modern archaeological techniques have begun uncovering physical evidence of Boudica's rebellion, adding material reality to literary accounts. The destruction layers found in London, Colchester, and St. Albans can now be precisely dated to 61 CE, confirming the timing and scale of her attacks. Chemical analysis of burnt debris reveals the intensity of the fires that consumed these Roman settlements. These discoveries don't just confirm historical accounts, they make them more immediate and real. Standing in the Museum of London, looking at charred grain and melted glass from Boudica's fires, visitors can connect directly with the physical reality of her rebellion. The abstract becomes concrete. The legendary becomes tangible. Archaeological evidence also reveals the sophistication of British material culture before and during the Roman period, challenging older assumptions about Celtic barbarism that made Roman conquest seem like inevitable progress. The metalwork, pottery, and artistic achievements of Boudica's people demonstrate that they possessed their own forms of civilization that were destroyed rather than improved by Roman rule. In our own time, Boudica's story continues to resonate with new generations facing their own forms of injustice and oppression. Her example speaks to anyone who has ever felt overwhelmed by systems too large and powerful to challenge. Anyone who has wondered whether individual resistance can make any difference against institutional authority. She reminds us that courage doesn't require the certainty of success, that some principles are worth defending even when victory seems impossible. Her rebellion failed in its immediate objectives, but succeeded in ways she could never have imagined, creating a legacy that has inspired resistance movements for 2 millennia. Modern feminists find in her story evidence that women have always been capable of leadership and courage, that gender has never been a legitimate barrier to political authority or military command. She becomes proof that the historical marginalization of women reflects cultural prejudice rather than natural limitation. But perhaps the most important aspect of Boudica's legacy lies not in any specific political lesson, but in the eternal questions her story raises about human nature and moral choice. What do we owe to our ancestors? What do we owe to our children? How much injustice should we accept for the sake of peace? When does accommodation become collaboration? When does prudence become cowardice? These questions have no easy answers, which is why Boudica's story remains compelling across cultures and centuries. She faced the same fundamental choices that confront every generation, whether to accept an unjust status quo or risk everything for the possibility of something better. Her decision to fight, regardless of the odds, speaks to something deep in human nature that refuses to be permanently conquered. Even today, if you travel through the English countryside where Boudica once rode, you can sense the weight of memory in the land itself. Ancient roads still follow routes that Roman engineers carved through British forests. Churches stand on sites that once housed Celtic temples. Modern field boundaries sometimes follow property lines established by Roman surveyors nearly 2,000 years ago. But the deeper memory is harder to pinpoint and impossible to map. It lives in the stories that parents tell their children, in the local legends that attach themselves to certain hills and valleys, in the persistent sense that this land has witnessed events too significant to be completely forgotten. Boudica's rebellion is part of that deeper memory, woven into the cultural DNA of a people who have always understood that freedom requires vigilance and courage. There's a particular kind of wisdom that comes from studying defeats rather than victories, from examining those who fought impossible battles rather than those who won easy wars. Boudica's rebellion teaches us that failure can be more inspiring than success, that moral victory sometimes matters more than military triumph, that the courage to resist injustice has value independent of its practical results. Her story reminds us that history's most important figures are often those who lost their immediate battles but won their long-term wars for memory and meaning. She failed to drive the Romans from Britain, but she succeeded in proving that British independence was worth fighting for. She failed to save her own kingdom, but she succeeded in creating a legend that would inspire countless others to resist tyranny in their own times and places. As we near the end of our journey through Boudica's story, perhaps we can find in it the same comfort that has sustained people for 2 millennia, the knowledge that we are part of a great continuity of human courage and resistance. Every time someone stands up to injustice, every time someone refuses to accept oppression as inevitable, every time someone chooses principle over safety, they add their own chapter to the story that Boudica began. The specific details of our struggles may be different from hers. We face challenges she could never have imagined, just as she faced hardships we can barely comprehend. But the fundamental choice remains the same, whether to accept injustice for the sake of peace, or to risk everything for the possibility of something better. In ancient Celtic tradition, certain fires were kept burning continuously, passed from one generation to the next as symbols of cultural continuity and spiritual connection. Boudica's rebellion was like one of those fires. It may have been extinguished in battle, but it was rekindled in memory and has been passed down through centuries of retelling. Each generation has added its own fuel to that fire, its own understanding of what her courage means and why her sacrifice matters. Roman historians preserved the basic facts. Medieval chroniclers wove them into broader narratives of resistance. Renaissance scholars grounded them in historical analysis. Modern archaeologists have uncovered their physical reality, and we continue the tradition tonight, adding our own voices to the great conversation about courage, justice, and the price of freedom. And so we return to where we began, in the quiet moments when history becomes personal and legend becomes real. Boudica's story started in a simple roundhouse where smoke rose from a central fire and children listened to their grandmother's tales. It ends in similar quiet moments, wherever people gather to remember that courage is possible, that resistance matters, that individual actions can echo across centuries. Her rebellion lasted 6 months, but its echoes continue. Her kingdom fell, but her memory endures. Her body returned to the British earth she fought to defend, but her spirit lives on in every heart that refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might imagine yourself standing in that ancient landscape where Boudica once rode. The roundhouses are gone now, replaced by modern homes with electric lights and central heating. The Roman roads are buried under motorways that carry traffic at speeds the ancients could never have imagined. Even the forests have changed, replanted and managed, according to scientific principles that would have seemed like magic to Celtic druids. But some things remain constant. The stars that guided Boudica's chariots still shine overhead, following the same paths they've traced for millions of years. The rivers still flow toward the sea, carrying with them the memories of all who have ever lived along their banks. The wind still stirs the grass and trees, whispering stories that only the land itself remembers completely. If you listen carefully to that wind, you might hear echoes of ancient voices, warriors preparing for battle, children learning the stories of their ancestors, elders passing down wisdom earned through generations of joy and sorrow. You might hear Boudica herself, not as the fierce queen of legend, but as the ordinary woman who made an extraordinary choice to resist injustice regardless of the cost. Let yourself drift now into that deeper rhythm that connects us to all who came before and all who will come after. Your own struggles, so immediate and pressing, are part of a vast pattern of human experience that stretches back to the beginning of memory and forward to the end of time. You are connected to Boudica not just through the accident of shared humanity, but through the deliberate choice to value dignity over safety, principle over convenience, love over fear. The problems that seem so overwhelming tonight will seem smaller in the morning light, not because they're less important, but because you'll remember that you're part of something larger than any individual crisis. You carry within you the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has ever faced impossible odds and found the courage to continue. You are heir to every act of resistance, every moment of grace, every choice to stand up rather than kneel down. Sleep now in the knowledge that you are enough, that your quiet courage matters, that your small acts of resistance contribute to the great wave of human dignity that no empire, no matter how powerful, can ever completely suppress. Rest in the ancient peace that comes from knowing your place in the great story, not as a footnote, but as a continuation, not as an ending, but as another beginning. The fire burns low now, as it has burned low in countless homes across countless centuries. The voices fade to whispers, as they always do when stories end and sleep begins. But the memory endures, and the choice remains, and somewhere in the space between dreaming and waking, the spirit of an ancient queen nods approval and whispers the words that echo across time. Well done. Rest now. The story continues tomorrow. In the gentle darkness that follows the telling of old tales, when the last embers glow like distant stars, and the night air carries the scent of cooling earth, we find ourselves exactly where we belong, connected to something larger than ourselves, comforted by the knowledge that courage has always existed and always will. Boudica's rebellion may have ended in defeat, but her spirit rides on in every act of resistance, every moment of moral courage, every choice to stand for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. The ancient Celts believed that stories were alive, that they grew and changed with each telling, gathering strength from the hearts and minds that received them. Tonight, Boudica's story has found new life in your listening, new meaning in your understanding, new power in your willingness to remember that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose love over fear, justice over comfort, hope over despair. Rest now, knowing that you carry within you the same strength that sustained a British queen through her darkest hours, the same faith that led her people into battle against impossible odds, the same unshakable conviction that some things are worth more than life itself. Sleep peacefully in the knowledge that her story continues in your dreams, her courage echoes in your heartbeat, and her legacy lives on in every dawn that brings another chance to choose light over darkness. The stars keep their eternal watch overhead, the same constellations that guided ancient warriors and comfort modern hearts. Beneath their gentle light, the world rests and renews itself, preparing for another day, another chance, another opportunity to write the next chapter in the endless story of human dignity and courage. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet strength of those who came before, the gentle wisdom of those who chose to fight for what they believed in, and the peaceful certainty that their courage lives on in you.